That's fine. Yeah.
Fantastic, amazing, thank you. So, I'm Paul. If you've not met me before, Paul Cornish. I work at We the Curious, and I'm part of the planetarium team there. And I mostly write the presenter scripts and train the presenters. And what I've been working on for the past few months is our autumn stargazing show that launches on September the 8th. And so we finished it now, but we've completely revamped it. We do it every year, and we make a few changes to our seasonal shows every year. But this year we've completely revamped autumn, and the research was absolutely fascinating for the show. I absolutely loved doing it. And this talk is about something remarkable I learned about while doing this research, and I wanted to share it because I think it's such an amazing story, such an amazing thing. And I don't think that many people know about it. It's not that well known. So each of our seasonal shows has a different theme. So, for example, winter is about the life cycle of stars, and summer is about the scale and the distance of everything in the universe. And autumn is about stories and discoveries. And when I did the first draft of this script, my manager, Adam, suggested that maybe we had a bit too much on discoveries and not enough on stories, and we needed to make it a little bit longer. So we had a section on Galileo, and we had a section on exoplanets, specifically exoplanet research in the present day. And what we needed to do was come up with a sort of narrative bridge between these two sections. And it occurred to me that a section about possibly a very early example of a science fiction story, maybe one about space travel and exploration, would be just the ticket. It would bridge that gap very nicely. But of course, the problem is, does something like this exist? So I went out there to look for it. And my experience writing these shows is that there is something out there for most of your needs for these scripts. It's just a matter of finding it. And I did find it. And in fact, this particular story, this particular topic, it couldn't have been more suitable for our show if I had made it up myself. And it's all about Johannes Kepler. Now, you've probably all heard of Johannes Kepler and his important contribution to astronomy. But did you know that in 1608, Johannes Kepler also wrote one of the very first science fiction stories ever written? And this is the story of that story. And the story begins in 1577. A German herb doctor named Katharina Kepler takes her 6-year-old son up a hill to look at the sky. And together they observe a comet as it blazes across the sky. And this comet was the Great Comet of 1577. It was a one-off, and it will not be seen from Earth again. And it leaves a remarkable impression on the little boy, and it sets him on a path that will see him change the world. This lad would, of course, go on to become Johannes Kepler. Well, he was Johannes Kepler. He didn't go on to become Johannes Kepler, but he went on to become one of the most important figures in the history of science. His work laid the foundation for the science that enabled humanity to head out into space. Kepler was many things. He was an astronomer, astrologer, a mathematician, a philosopher, and he was also a writer of fiction. And 361 years before humans set foot on the moon, Kepler wrote Somnium, which is Latin for the dream. Somnium was a novel about traveling to the moon with the aid of demons. And you are now looking at a reproduction of the title page. Carl Sagan called this one of the first works of science fiction. But alas, for Kepler and his mother, it ended up being more of a tragedy. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about who Kepler was. Now, a lot of you are going to be familiar with this, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because I feel it adds a little bit of context to our story. Kepler began his career as a maths teacher, and eventually he became the imperial mathematician to the Holy Roman Emperor. And in between, he worked as an assistant to this guy, Tycho Brahe, very famous astronomer in his own right, an important figure in the history of astronomy. But unfortunately for him, he is probably most remembered for his prosthetic brass nose, which he gained after being injured in a drunken sword fight. Now, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent about Brahe, but I promise this is relevant to our boy Kepler. Brahe's official cause of death was kidney stones, but according to Kepler's first-hand account, there was a bit more to it than that. Brahe was dining with the Danish emperor, and he desperately needed a whiz, and he felt it would have been rude to leave the table before royalty, so Brahe left it in. He held it in, rather. Now, this had a tragic effect. Back home, Brahe found it difficult and painful to urinate. And then a few days later, his bladder burst and he died. So this proves, I think, that sucking up to royalty is hazardous for your health. Now, as a good story, and it is a sad story, but it's kind of a good story as well. As good a story as this might be, some historians over the years have suspected a darker truth. And you might think that having your bladder burst after holding in the need to urinate is pretty dark in itself. But some historians have said, well, there may be an even darker truth behind this. A 1901 autopsy of Brahe's exhumed remains found traces of mercury in what was left of his beard, and they found no evidence of kidney stones. And by the way, you are looking at an actual picture of Tycho Brahe's skull, which blows my mind that you can just find this on the internet. You know, something that was walking around in this guy's face 400 years ago. It blows me away. But anyway, this is his skull. And yeah, they dug him up in 1901, did an autopsy on him, and found this. So this discovery of the traces of mercury in his beard, this led to speculation that Brahe may have been poisoned. So who would have poisoned him? Well, one of the suspects was none other than Kepler himself. Now, Kepler was heavily influenced by the work of Nicolaus Copernicus. Less than 100 years earlier, Copernicus had presented the revolutionary idea that the sun was the center of everything rather than the earth. And most people at the time, including Brahe, rejected this idea. Brahe had his own ideas about a geocentric universe, and he didn't want to give his assistant Kepler full access to his lifetime's worth of astronomical notes, because Brahe was worried that Kepler would use these notes to pursue his own crazy ideas about a heliocentric universe. But when Brahe died, all his notes went to Kepler. And Kepler went on to use this lifetime's worth of astronomical notes to make some of his, to write some of his most important work. So this is a pretty big motive, getting his hand on these notes. Could Kepler have killed for this knowledge? Well, it's possible, but it's very unlikely. Brahe was dug up again in 2010, and spectroscopic analysis of his bones and his hair detected mercury, but not enough mercury to have killed him. So it's likely that the presence of mercury was probably a consequence of Brahe's scientific experiments. Everyone was fiddling around with mercury back then. So Kepler probably wasn't a murderer, and Brahe probably should have just got over himself and went to the toilet when he needed to. But that's a bit of a digression. The important thing I want you to take away from this is that Kepler was a massive Copernicus fanboy. That's the thing we're taking away from this. So despite believing in such a radical idea as heliocentrism, Kepler was no iconoclast. He was very religious. And he said that he felt God's work in the ideas of Copernicus. Kepler used Brahe's observations of the planets to expand on these heliocentric ideas, and he discovered that the orbits of the planets followed three laws. And I'm going to give a little simplified version of these three. Number one, the planets in our solar system move around the sun in an elliptical shape, not a circular shape, as everyone believed at the time. Number two, the planets are all moving at different speeds, depending on how close they are to the sun. Number three, there is an exact mathematical link between a planet's distance from the sun and the amount of time it takes to revolve around the sun. Now, Kepler, he came up with this, but he didn't like it. He struggled with these laws because, like many philosophers of the time, Kepler really liked circles. He loved circles. He believed the circle was the universe's perfect shape. And as the orbits of the planets were a manifestation of God's divine order, then surely they must be circular. So it was a bit of a shock to Kepler to find that the orbits weren't a circle. They were in fact elliptical. I guess this ties back into Jenny's talk about misconceptions here. He really struggled with this idea, but to his credit, he eventually rolled with it, albeit after many years of trying to make the idea of circular orbits match up with his findings, but he did eventually come to terms with it. Now, Carl Sagan in particular really admired Kepler for not letting his religious beliefs colour his conclusions. And Sagan said of Kepler, when he found that his long-cherished beliefs did not agree with the most precise observations, he accepted the uncomfortable facts. He preferred the hard truth to his dearest delusions, and that is the heart of science. So I thought I'd share that because I really like that quote. And when I went through this with my partner Jenny the other day, I tried to do an impression of Carl Sagan, but she said it didn't really work. So I've spared you that, my Carl Sagan impression. Anyway, these laws are incredibly important. Years later, Isaac Newton would go on to use these three laws to put together his own law of gravity. In the early 1600s, however, Kepler still had to convince people that the Earth was going around the sun. And this is where Somnium comes in. Kepler hoped to use his fiction to convince people of a heliocentric universe. His book wasn't just an early work of science fiction, it was actually an early piece of science communication. Pretty amazing. Now, the novel begins from the point of view of Kepler himself. And in the novel, Kepler falls asleep while reading about a mythical Czech sorceress. And within the dream, Kepler is reading a different book, the story of an Icelandic boy called Duracatus. I think that's how you say it, Duracatus, who gets sold to a sailor and ends up working for Tycho Brahe. So this might sound a bit familiar to you here. And while working under Brahe, the boy develops a love of astronomy. Eventually, the boy travels home to his mother, a herb doctor with an interest in astronomy. Again, sounds familiar. Another detail from real life. Katerina Kepler, as we said at the start of the talk, was a herb doctor. Anyway, the mother in the book is delighted that her son now shares her interest. And so she shares with him the secret of summoning demons. These demons can travel to the island of Lavania, otherwise known as the moon. And these demons can even take people with them. Duracatus meets his mother's favorite demon, who explains that Lavania, aka the moon, is 50,000 German miles high up in the sky. And this demon also explains that traveling to the moon is not for wimps. Now, this is a quote from the book. "We do not admit desk-bound humans into these ranks, nor the fat, nor the foppish. But we choose those who regularly spend their time hunting with swift horses, or those who voyage in ships to the Indies and are accustomed to living on hard bread, garlic-dried fish, and other abhorrent foods." So these demons had very strict standards for who they took to the moon. They didn't just take any old Tom, Dick, or Harry. By the way, these images you're seeing, they aren't from Somnium. These are illustrations from a book from 1720 called The History of Witches and Wizards. I just thought they illustrated it quite well. And I'm particularly keen on this image you're looking at now. These are witches giving the devil some wax dolls for him to baptize. And if you look at his face, he looks really touched by the gesture. Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out because it's quite funny. But anyway, back to Somnium. So in the book, the demons can take human companions to the moon by pushing them there with great force. And this is described in the book, this force, as not unlike an explosion of gunpowder as he is hurled above the mountains and the seas. During the journey, the demons must shield themselves from the light of the sun with the shadow of the earth. And the demons can protect their companion from the cold of space, but the humans must push damp sponges up their noses in order to breathe. Now, there aren't just demons on the moon, there are also alien creatures on the moon. And these alien creatures call the Earth vulva. And I think that comes from revolve. So again, there was this idea of the Earth revolving around the sun that Kepler wanted to convey. Now, the moon is divided into two sides. The aliens on the side of the moon facing the Earth are called subvolvans. And they are forever blessed by the light from Volva, which for them takes the place of our moon. They're also the pre-Volvans who live on the far side of the moon. They aren't so lucky. They are eternally deprived any sight of the Earth. These moon aliens are very different from humans. This is how they're described by Kepler. Whatever springs from the land or walks upon the land is of a monstrous size. Increases in size are very rapid. Life is of short duration because all living things grow to such an enormous bodily mass. The Prevolvans have no fixed dwelling place in the space of a single day. They traverse the whole of their world in hordes, following the receding waters either on legs that are longer than those of our camels, on wings, or in boats. Now, to the occupants of the moon, Lavania appears to stand unmoving among the moving stars, no less than our Earth appears to we humans. The view of the stars and the planets is so different to the view from Earth that the aliens, according to Kepler, have entirely their own system of astronomy. So this is really important. These moon aliens have a completely different perspective on the universe to us. The demon goes on to describe further details about the moon, but suddenly Kepler is awoken by a storm outside to find it was all a dream. So it's incredible to think that Somnium was written in a time when so little was known about our place in space, or even about the moon. Kepler wrote the book in 1608, so this was a year before his mate Galileo, because he used to write to Galileo, they used to write to each other, but this was a year before Galileo turned his telescope towards the moon and recorded what he saw. This is pretty amazing stuff. It's full, Somnium is, it's full of amazing predictions. Modern astronauts do indeed have to be physically fit, just as Kepler describes. Astronauts do indeed need protection from the sun's rays, and they need methods of breathing in space. It might not be damp sponges up their nose, but they still need methods of breathing in space, and they need methods of controlling their temperature. Kepler got the distance from the Earth to the Moon wrong. It's actually an average of 238,855 miles away rather than 50,000 miles. But having said that, Kepler's basic point that the Moon was just really, really, really far away, that was spot on. Several decades before Newton discussed gravity or laws of motion, Kepler suggested that a tremendous force would be necessary to launch travelers into space, and he was correct. However, that force eventually would not be provided by demons, but by powerful rockets like the one you're looking at now. Maybe the most striking thing, I think, about Somnium is the incredible display of imagination and empathy on Kepler's part. He's not only created alien beings, but he's actually put himself into their shoes. And he showed his readers a completely new perspective on the universe. Now, Kepler didn't publish Somnium, but he didn't publish it, but he did pass it around his friends. And unfortunately, at some point in 1611, the manuscript got away from him and it began to be passed around Europe. And the result of this was distorted accounts of the book's contents getting spread through barbershop gossip. And eventually, these distorted accounts of the contents of the book reached the hometown of Kepler's mother, Katerina. Katerina had gotten into an argument with a neighbor because apparently she was a bit of a difficult woman, truth be told. Even Kepler wrote in his university days of how difficult his mother was. And so his mother had got into an argument with a neighbor, and as a result, she had been accused of witchcraft. Now, for an elderly woman in 1615, and she was an elderly woman, she was in her early 70s at this point. So for a woman this age, in 1615, the accusation of witchcraft was itself as good as a death sentence. Between 1580 and 1630, it's estimated that around 50,000 people were burnt at the stake after being prosecuted for the crime of witchcraft. And many of those people accused were over 40, and most of them were women. Now, Kepler himself believed that Somnium had provided his mother's accusers with damning evidence. He believed that his mother's accusers had used the fact that the mother in the book had summoned demons as proof that his own mother was doing the same thing in real life. Now, to be fair, there's no evidence in the court records that this book was used as evidence against her. This was something Kepler himself believed. And as a result, he added copious footnotes to Somnium much later on. And these footnotes in Somnium, he emphatically explained that this was a work of fiction and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. He really hammered that home in the footnotes. Because as you can imagine, he probably felt really guilty about this. Rather than enlighten people, Kepler's book had fueled this deadly ignorance. And now his own mother, the woman who had first inspired him to look up at the stars, was going to pay the price. Katerina's trial began in 1620. She was imprisoned and she was threatened with torture. And this is an illustration of Katerina Kepler being threatened with torture here. She was also apparently threatened with being stretched on the wheel, which was a particularly gruesome method of torture they had at the time. But in the face of this, she confessed nothing. Her son devoted himself completely to her defense. He even gave up his job and he moved his whole family from Austria, where they were living, back to his hometown in Germany. Now, this wasn't, as it would be today, a matter of packing a van. This was back in the 1620, and the 30 Years' War was raging on. This was one of the most destructive wars in European history. And Kepler was taking his whole family, moving his whole life across Europe for the sake of his mother in the middle of a massive war. So this was a big deal. Kepler devoted all his super scientific genius to freeing his mother. He went through each of the accusations against his mother, and there were a lot of them, and he provided logical and medical and scientific explanations for every single magical act of which she was accused. And believe it or not, it worked. Kepler secured his mother's release from prison in 1621. Now, unfortunately, at that point, Katerina, who was in her, as I said, in her early 70s, she had spent 14 months sleeping on a floor in a stone cell. So she died shortly after her release in 1622. This was only a few months after she was set free. Now, these days, a statue of her stands in the village of her birth, a village called Eltingen in Germany. Now, I was initially, when I found out about this statue, I was like, oh, this is quite touching. They've remembered her. Why aren't more people talking about the fact that there's a statue of her? And then I discovered it was put up in 1937 by Nazis. So that's not quite so sweet. So apparently they wanted a symbol of like rustic nobility and honest toil. You can see she's holding like a sickle there, so it was just a bit of Nazi propaganda, but I guess it's nice that she's remembered in some way. Her death was just one of the many tragedies faced by Johannes Kepler during his life. 3 of his 5 children, with his first wife Barbara, died very young. Barbara herself died of smallpox. Kepler later remarried, and 3 of the 6 children he had with his second wife, Susanna, also died. So frankly, he had a hell of a time of it. In 1630, he contracted a fever and he passed away aged 58. His son Ludwig published Somnium 4 years later in 1634, so it did get published eventually. Now, despite all the hardship he faced, Kepler's contribution to science was absolutely incredible. Now, I mentioned earlier on that him and Galileo wrote back and forth to each other. In a letter to Galileo in 1610, Kepler wrote of ships or sails adapted to the breezes of heaven, and he imagined future explorers who would no longer shrink from the vast expanse of space. Over 300 years later, NASA's Apollo program enabled human beings to travel to the moon for the first time. And Kepler's laws of planetary motion laid the foundations for the science that got them there. In 1968, as his spacecraft orbited the moon, the Apollo 8 astronaut William Anders took this very famous photograph that you're looking at now. It's of the Earth rising behind the lunar horizon, the light of Volva taking the place of the moon in the sky, just as Kepler imagined. So in the end, Kepler himself set humanity on the path to making his dream a reality, which I think is quite a lovely ending to the story. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to share here and also in the comments section, these 2 links. The first link is, I used loads of articles and stuff to research this, but that article in particular, the brainpickings.org one, was definitely the best. And then the link below that, somniumproject.wordpress, that's got a lot of Somnium on the internet that you can read for yourself. A lot of it's in the original Latin and they translate it to English too. So I found that incredibly useful. So